or 4.
That's correct. Yeah. It was the main girl down the block that I was looking at that I blame her for it. That being said though, I thought it was a tank. So I called it Sherman, as in Sherman tank.
Yeah. Okay.
And then later on I found out it wasn't so much a Sherman tank, but that being said, funny story. That being said,
so its bumper fell off just like Guinevere's.
Pretty much. The radiator was busted. That's how bad it was. So you talk 4 miles an hour. I would say about maybe 7 or 8. But the Isuzu Rodeo back tire had something to do with it. It wasn't just a head on. And so did the girl I was looking at. However, we are not all perfect people. However, but that's what I did. I named my first car was a 77 Volvo Barnes, and I called it Sherman.
Nice.
I had that.
Nice.
Yeah.
So my first car was the 90, my personal first car. Actually, I'm lying. I did eventually name my 89 Ford Taurus, which was my very first car, which was my grandfather's car, because I was in Manhasset when the air conditioning compressor set on fire. So the car was forever known as Firestarter after that.
Nice.
I made a right turn on red, and then all of a sudden my friend's like, something's on fire. I'm like, stop it. What could possibly, it's not in his car. He made me pull over. I popped the hood and flames. So I'm not even going to finish that story. Not because, yeah, okay. Anyway, and then it was forever named Firestarter, and then my Eclipse was red, so it was Firebolt because it had to fit in the theming, and then I never named a car again. But so I named those 2 cars. And basically I did exactly what Barley did. He had Guinevere and Guinevere 2. I had Firestarter and Firebolt. I mean, it wasn't that different. But back to the movie. This is not a podcast about my cars, or yours.
Or mine, yeah.
He's clearly obsessed with this game, and more importantly, he's actually obsessed with the history of the area. He loves the history. We find out very early that his mom's boyfriend is a cop in the area, and he's come over to talk to Barley because Barley's trying to stop them from tearing down what I like to call Chekhov's water fountain, because it becomes very important later for some reason or other. But he's trying to get them to stop because it's historical and you shouldn't be destroying historical areas. And I completely agree with him. I live in Manhattan. They knock down everything after like 10 years. They just 10 years gone, 10 years gone. Bye. See you. Bye. Gone. I mean, it's amazing that there's anything left of the Empire State Building at this point because it's over 10 years old. But,
oh my God,
and the White Horse Tavern was the tavern that actually George Washington stood in. I can't believe that thing's still standing. How they haven't bulldozed that yet with their policies. I don't know because we just knocked down everything after 10 years. But somehow that survived. So, but I agree. I think things should last. And something like that fountain that's been there for eons shouldn't go. And if it did, guess what? We would have lost a major piece of history of the area. Not to mention, a stone and a giant dragon monster.
Yeah. Forbid we should, take away the stone and the dragon monster. History is very important to some people. And when you live in a town, you live in New York City, I live in Vegas, both historic towns, right? So when you visit towns, especially
both
if you haven't been
towns,
there
by the way,
so long.
Both historic towns that love to knock stuff down and build new. We've had this beautiful hotel since Vegas started. Tear it down. We got to build the
new one.
We need a Billzor here. One. What's a Billzor? Who knows? But we're going to build it, and people are going to love it. And they're going to say it's the Billzor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, again, living out here as long as I have, I've seen a lot of them, imploded, and you see, and much with everything else that gets torn down, you draw the audience in, and those people who have worked at the hotels, or those people who've lived in town for so long. But even outside the hotel, because Vegas isn't just a strip, although people like to think of it, that Vegas is just 8 miles long. There is a lot of stuff in Vegas that is very cultural. The mob museum that we have downtown was the very first post office that was ever put in the state. So that's a little bit of a history.
It's funny you say post office. In New York, we're tearing apart the inside of the oldest post office in Manhattan and turning it into a train station. We're keeping the outside the same, but we're tearing apart the inside, and very little of it's staying in the post office, and the rest is becoming Moynihan train station. Your first post office is now a mob museum. See what I'm saying here?
Yeah, we have a lot in common. We're not just podcasters, folks. We're friends with a lot of stuff in common.
So we needed a Barley to stop this from happening.
Exactly. That's the main point, is we needed somebody to step up and keep everything original and keep everything as new. And Barley seems to me the type of guy that loves history and loves architecture and loves agriculture and loves to see stuff as is. And what he does is he takes that and he formulates in his head what it is, and what it represents to him, and puts it out there as if it was, again, this adventure that they go on.
So, and I don't think this is an accident at all. Like, see, it's not just a quirk of the movie, or it's not just a way of him getting to know the magic to teach his brother, which we find out later that's what he does. I think that's part of it. They needed this aspect of his life so that they could have him have a reason to know the magic and all this other stuff. But more importantly, he's someone who cares of where we came from. And that plays really huge in the end of the movie for me. So, all right, I keep dancing around it, but here's the bottom line. Everyone thinks this movie is somehow about Ian and somehow about the father, but it's not. The movie is not about Ian or the father. The movie's about Barley. Barley seems like a secondary character, but he's the most important character in this movie because he's the only one, besides the mother, who knows the father and Ian. He's the link between Ian and the father, which is so evident at the end of this movie. He is the reason why Ian didn't need to meet the father. And he needed to meet the father because his last memory of his father was on those machines. And he never wanted to tell Ian that. He doesn't tell him till 3/4 of the way through this movie that he was too afraid to say goodbye. He never got a chance to say goodbye to his father. He's the main storyline going on this whole time, but we're so distracted with Ian and the father's legs that until the very end, it's really hard to see that Barley's actually the main plot point.
I totally agree. And it took me to the end to find out that Barley was the link. I'll say it now. I was going to say it for final thoughts, but I'll say it now. Barley was the father for Ian. Everything that Ian had on the checklist, Barley did. And that's because of Barley knowing what is going on and Ian being too young, had to step up and become that father figure in a sense.
Yes.
But had to fill the role. And Barley did that. And of course, we know Ian realizes it later on, but we'll save that for final thoughts. But again, you're absolutely correct. Barley is the link. And it's Barley who is the dad.
Right. And it's part of his holding on to the past probably is that his father passed away, because I know that's part of it for me. Right. And him knowing so well his father makes him be able to be a good father figure to his brother. And that's the part where I feel that people who are really upset that Ian never gets to meet the father, they're missing that aspect of this movie. That's not really what it's about to begin with. He learned who his father was through Barley, and Barley became the father figure for him, and Barley missed the opportunity to say goodbye. And I'm amazed that I'm not crying right now because I couldn't explain this to my wife an hour ago without bawling. But I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my father. I never got that chance. And the reason I never got that chance was I had spent years and years and years going in and out of hospitals, not for my health, for my father's health. For the last 5 or so years, and I remember I was only 14 when he passed. For the last 5 or so years, he had been in and out of hospitals getting amputations because of diabetes. He had awful circulation in his legs. Because of that, he would lose a toe, and then he'd be in and out of the hospital. He also worked in hospitals. So I had spent vast amounts of my life in and out of North Shore University Hospital simply because he worked there or was a patient there. And when he was a patient there, he'd be a patient there for months at a time, not a week here, a week there. He'd be there for 2-3 months. And but I remember, as the story goes, the last day of my father's, it's not really the last day of my father's life, but the last day, my father was in a coma for 3 days. The last day before the coma happened, he was the kind of man that he knew that the radiologist, my father was a radiologist at North Shore University. He knew the radiologist was behind, right, at like 2 a.m. There was just a massive amount of calls, and the guy that came in, got the beep, because when you're on call, you don't stay in the hospital as a radiologist. You get beeped and you come in as fast as you can. And I can remember numerous nights my dad getting that beep, and sometimes he'd actually take us, and we'd go in, and like we couldn't do anything. Obviously, that'd be illegal. But like I'd sit in the control room, and there would be like 5 or 6 computers laying around, and he'd be working on the one, setting up the cameras, doing this, doing that. Inject the guy with the isotope, put the guy in the machine. He'd be doing the cameras on one computer, and then I'd be on another, just like flipping through pictures of scans of probably highly illegal, but whatever. I was flipping, and I'd see all these hearts, and they had this really cool camera to take. They didn't have a way to print them off the screen back then. There was no like print button. So you'd actually take this camera that had this big cone that was exactly the size of the screen at the end of the cone, but it would get narrow to the lens of the camera, and you'd shoot it like a gun. And then it would print out a Polaroid of the scan. It was really cool. I mean, I would bring it in for like show and tells at times. There's no patient information on it or anything like that. Like, it didn't give people's names or anything, but I'd bring pictures of lungs and hearts and all this other cool stuff. So I'd be like flipping through that stuff at like 9 years old on a random Tuesday in July, because my dad got called in and I was still awake or something, And but so the day he had his coma, he went into his coma. He had a stroke, and at 2, 3, and 4 in the morning, he was working, not paid, working to help this guy catch up. Went back to his room, had a stroke. They found him responsive, but in bad shape. He slipped into a coma. And I remember it was a Friday. Now, we would go to the hospital every other day or so, but I'd speak to my dad every single day when he was in the hospital. But we'd go every other. So I lived, go to school, go to baseball, go to the hospital, go home. And back then, you got to remember, things were very different, especially in it wasn't like a maternity ward or anything. So visiting hours were very regulated. I mean, there was like a 3-hour period where you could show up. So sometimes it was go to school, go to see him, go to a baseball game, And he went into the coma on a Friday. And I remember, because I went to school and I'd gotten a good grade on a test, and I hadn't been doing so well that year. Again, I'm 14, so I'm in junior high school. And I had just gotten a sociology test, and this is the kicker here. The test was on Star Trek episodes, because my sociology teacher would teach by using the Klingons as a stand-in or the Romulans as a stand-in. So it was a sociology class, but the teacher actually liked Star Trek and used Star Trek. It's how I got into podcasting, was because of this teacher, who I can't for the life of me remember her name. She was the dean of my junior high school. But so I come home with this great grade. I got like a 98 on this test, and I was so ready to tell my father, call him up and say, "Hey, Dad, I did really good. You'll be proud of me." And I lived in an apartment building on the 6th floor, and the doors open to the elevator, and I step off. And as I step off, I can kind of hear something going on in the hallway somewhere, but I don't know what's going on. But I had this really awful feeling. And as I walked through the door, my mom and my grandmother, my mother's mom, not my dad's mom, because she was living in Florida at the time, but are crying. And I don't know what's happening yet. And they tell me my father went into a coma. And after everything kind of calmed down, like nothing really calmed down, but you know what I mean? Like everyone wasn't hysterical anymore. My mom says to me, "Well, do you want to go say goodbye?" It was probably the next day or whatever. There's no way he's coming back. Your father's brain dead. It's just a matter of when, not if, which is a really heavy conversation to have as a 14-year-old. Do you want to go say goodbye? And I actually said, "Does he look like himself, or does he look normal, or something along those lines?" And my mom was like, "Well, he's hooked to a respirator and this and that, and there's tubes everywhere." And like Barley, I could not bring myself to go. I stayed home. I stayed with my grandmother, and I wouldn't. And I've, to some degree, resented that decision, regretted that decision the rest of my life, because I never got to say goodbye. I never said goodbye. So I completely understand how Barley feels because he doesn't even want to tell his brother that memory. And we've skipped a large